pleasure to welcome Dr. Susan Stronge from London, who is the Senior Curator in the Asian Department of the V&A Victoria and Albert Museum in London. She specializes in the arts of the Sikh and Muslim courts of the Indian subcontinent and has curated the award-winning 1999 exhibition, The Arts of the Sikh Kingdoms. Her books include Painting for the Mughal Emperor, Tipu's Tigers, and the catalogue of her recent exhibitions, Bejewelled Treasures, the Thani Collection. Her current project is a V&A loan exhibition to the Herbert Gallery in Coventry in England, and that will open in October 2017. This focuses on the artistic legacy of the cities of Amritsar and Lahore. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stronge.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, and I extend my warmest gratitude to Narinder, the Sikh Foundation, for inviting me to come here and present this paper. And I also would like to thank, of course, Sonia, who's worked heroically to put all this together, and Inderjit Singh Thakur. On one level, it seems slightly odd to be talking about an exhibition that took place all this time ago in 1999. But I think it's important to make the point that art is not frozen in time. It doesn't belong to a particular moment. Things evolve, and museums particularly are not fossilized entities, despite their often publicly being perceived like that. Art evolves, the interpretation of works of art evolves and reflects the time in which they're being written about. The V&A in London has a remarkable South Asian collection, remarkable for the range of the arts of historic Punjab and for the arts of Punjab under Sikh rule. And so when Narinder had the inspirational idea to do an exhibition, that we should put on an exhibition to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the founding of the Sikh Khalsa, it was a big question. What do we do which would be suitable for a UK national museum, which would be an exhibition which would appeal to a very broad general V&A audience, which includes not just a UK audience, but European tourists, children, a very wide range of people, and which would also be very meaningful specifically to a Sikh audience. And so we concentrated, of course, on our collection, and one of the most important objects in the entire museum, one of the most famous artifacts, is the golden throne of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. And what you may not know is that it came to England from Punjab at the annexation of the Punjab when the British took Punjab. It came not to South Kensington, but to the Indian Museum, which was the Museum of the East India Company in Leadenhall Street in the city. And it was only when the Indian Museum collections were amalgamated with the V&A, the South Kensington Museum as it then was in 1879, that it came to South Kensington. But if you look at guidebooks of London in the 19th century, when they're talking about the Indian Museum or the South Kensington Museum, the golden throne of Maharaja Ranjit Singh is always one of the objects which is singled out. So obviously that was going to be one of the most important artifacts in the exhibition. And then that leads naturally on to the personality of the man who sat on it. And one of the great privileges of working in a museum is that you are surrounded by artifacts which belong to remarkable figures of the past. And you stand next to something like this and you can imagine the body of Ranjit Singh actually sitting on this throne. You have concealed direct links with Maharaja Ranjit Singh in paintings like this, which belongs to the V&A as well, because this actually went from Ranjit Singh's hand to the hand of Van Cortlandt, one of his colonels who worked for him, who was one of his military commanders. So this was a present from the Maharaja to Van Cortlandt, stayed in his family, with his family ever since, and then was presented to the museum in the 50s. And so you have a story about people, which is obviously going to be interesting. You have a direct connection with the past. You have works of art of a respectable level. And you also have reflections of different levels of society of Punjab under the rule of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. And this Nihang turban and the picture next to it have always the picture particularly has always rather intrigued me because it looks like a caricature of these ragtag and bobtail characters who followed the army, who nevertheless fought like lions in the Sikh army. But when we put the helmet into the turban, into the show, our Sikh advisors, collaborators pointed out that this couldn't possibly have stayed on a human head. It would have fallen off. It was too small. It just doesn't work functionally. And so perhaps it was a tourist souvenir. Perhaps it was made for the British in the second half of the 19th century. But if we go back to the throne, the workmanship is astonishing, and it also summons up some of the themes of the court of Ranjit Singh, because we know the maker of the throne. This was made by a Muslim goldsmith, Hafiz Muhammad Multani. It was made probably in Lahore, but it also encapsulates the Punjab at this time. The opulence and some of the motifs on the throne are replicated in the Golden Temple, which of course was refurbished for Maharaja Ranjit Singh at the very beginning of his reign. Other paintings in the V&A, and about 2/3 of the Arts of the Sikh Kingdoms exhibition came from the V&A collection, because of course if you do a big exhibition like this, it costs a lot of money. It costs a lot of money to put it on, to prepare the objects and so on. And if you add to that a lot of loans from other institutions, the costs go up exponentially. So we stuck to our own collections as far as possible. And this is a painting by an English visitor to the Punjab, William Carpenter, and it shows a glimpse of life in the Golden Temple at a time when it wasn't enclosed in the way that it is now. We also put in some of these marvellous photographs by the Italian photographer Beato, and these were some of the most appealing, I think, images that drew people. You could see when they were coming into the exhibition, they were drawn immediately to these pictures of the Golden Temple before its restoration in the late 20th century. Textiles was something that featured very heavily, because this is part of the great strengths of the V&A collection. In the second half of the 19th century particularly, the V&A was collecting enormously to reflect and document the textile production, not just of the Punjab, but of the entire Indian subcontinent. And of course this is an extraordinarily rich ancient tradition in terms of the artistic production, the craft production of the Indian subcontinent. And it was reflected in a major exhibition last year at the V&A, The Fabric of India, by my colleagues Rosemary Carrill and Divya Patel. We also, of course, put in a lot of Kashmir shawls, because Kashmir, as I don't need to tell you, was part of the Sikh Kingdom. And the trade in Kashmir shawls was clearly stimulated hugely by Ranjit Singh. And shawls were worn, of course, by men and by women, but they were also used as furnishings. And we see the sort of depiction of the Sardar on the left wearing a very fine Kashmir shawl. And this is another element of the exhibition, that we showed things next to each other to show, for instance, the shawl cloth, the quality of it and the way that it was being worn. But we also showed in these paintings the personalities of the region. We don't know the identity of the Sikh Sardar. We do know the identity of this suspicious-looking character on the right, who is Gulab Singh of Jammu and later Jammu and Kashmir. And other characters which came out in the story of Punjab were Dus Muhammad of Kabul, who was drawn by Veen, one of the Europeans going through the Punjab at the time. Now, when we were putting all this together, we had very little connection with the Sikh communities in the UK. And so we were very dependent on making links with as wide a network as possible. Narinder had a network that he linked us up to, and I reached out to as many people as I could. One of the most effective ways that we had of bringing people into the exhibition was by giving sets of images to volunteers who were based in Gurudwaras. And we did a training session for these volunteers. We gave them the images, and then they went out, not just around London, but much further afield, and gave introductory sessions about the exhibition. And that brought in coach loads of people. I mean, every weekend the museum was just full of Sikhs who were coming from all over the UK, some as far as Scotland, just to see the exhibition. And so that was really quite an effective way. It wasn't one that we had thought of. We were very dependent on advice from Sikh organisations and Sikh individuals for doing it. But it provided a model which we could follow later on in other exhibitions. The military Sikhs was a very key part of the exhibition, as you can imagine. And on many of the weapons, there were inscriptions not just in Punjabi, but also in Persian. And I wanted to highlight, there was discussion this morning about the crucial importance of teaching the younger generation Punjabi, but I'd also stress that Persian is absolutely crucial for anyone understanding the past of Punjab, because this, as it was a Mughal province, it was subject to Mughal rule, and therefore the language of the Mughal Empire, the administrative and cultural language, was Persian. So the histories of the Mughals were written in Persian, but so was Ranjit Singh's official court history. And therefore, to understand the history of the secular history of the Sikh Punjab, it's important that Persian is studied, as the older generation of Sikh scholars certainly did. And just to highlight the point of the importance of this is something which Jean-Marie Lafont alluded to, the Tutiname of this is a manuscript done for Akbar in the 1580s, and this was a manuscript actually owned by Ranjit Singh. And the Tutiname is a series of moral tales which are presented in terms of a dialogue between the parrot and Khojasta, who was a merchant's wife. The merchant was away, and Khojasta was tempted to stray and meet a lover every evening. So the parrot told her tales which would beguile her and keep her at home and keep her faithful to her husband. This is a detached page from the manuscript. The manuscript, while it was with Ranjit Singh, it stayed intact. As soon as it came west, dealers started to do what they have done systematically in the last decades, century and a half, to tear out the illustrated pages, because they get more for detached pages than they do for an intact illustrated manuscript. So this is a page acquired in the early 20th century by the V&A. The rest of the manuscript is now in the Chester Beatty Library. The end of the exhibition touched lightly on the second half of the 19th century, because we didn't want it to have a downward fall. We didn't want it to be a story of the end of a kingdom. We wanted it to show the revival, the continuity of traditions in Punjab. But it was a smaller story. But it's one that we will revive for the Coventry exhibition. And I should say that after our exhibition finished at the V&A, that wasn't the end of the engagement with Sikh Punjab. It is now embedded into the V&A South Asian Arts course. And someone this morning mentioned the importance of martial arts in the story of the Sikhs. And one of the highlights of our Arts of the Sikh Kingdoms component in the South Asian Art course is a demonstration of Gatka. And it's a very, I mean, for me, it always amuses me enormously to see this very English, white-haired audience watching this fantastically dramatic demonstration of Gatka. But on a more serious level, the link between faith and martial arts is always brought forward by the people who are doing the demonstration. And more interestingly, in the context of the V&A, they always make the link between Gatka and paintings of Punjab very clear. So it's a very, very important presentation of martial arts in a Sikh context. We have had lectures on Sikh subjects, notably the lecture series sponsored by Narinda's family, and we've had musical events and so on. But then the most recent thing that's happening is that we were approached last year by the Herbert Museum in Coventry, who wanted to do an exhibition in some way connected with UK India 2017, which is a kind of it's an excuse to celebrate independence of India, and it has money attached to it, which means that lots of museums are doing events to mark this event. And Coventry wanted to do some sort of exhibition that would have relevance to their local Punjabi community. They don't have any collections which are relevant. They don't have any curators, but they have great expertise in educational events, outreach programs and so on. And crucially, they want to use it to launch a bid for City of Culture. Now in the UK this is quite important. It's something which comes up every 4 years, where cities which have been perhaps industrial cities of great wealth in the past, which are now falling on very hard times where unemployment rates are quite high, can put in a bid for City of Culture, and then that draws in money to regenerate the cultural institutions, and then it regenerates the economy. And this has happened to Hull, who were the last city to get it, and Liverpool before. And so Coventry, a great industrial city now, where the industries have fallen away, wanted to do this as a centrepiece of their bid for City of Culture. So we decided that we would put together, I mean, they were talking about an exhibition on the lines of the arts of the Sikh Kingdoms. We didn't want to repeat that, and we couldn't repeat it. So we wanted to do something rather different, which would have a Punjabi relevance. And so we decided that we would do an exhibition on arts and crafts of Punjab in the 19th century, because this would allow us to show completely different things, but also which would have relevance to the manufacturing traditions of Coventry, which is bicycle manufacturing, cars and so on. So they wanted a concentration on making. So we will put in things like this shield, which was exhibited at the 1851 exhibition in London, and as you can see is not in great condition. So this exhibition gives us a marvellous excuse to conserve some of our interesting pieces. And if you look at the book of the Thani Collection, you'll see a shield which is actually rather better than this, but very similar and probably made in the same place. We know that this was made in Patiala, and it was almost certainly made for the Great Exhibition. The next thing that I can show you is a model of a garden with a Persian water wheel, which was made of ivory, some of it stained green, in Amritsar. And the theme, I suppose the unofficial subtitle of the exhibition is A Tale of Two Punjabi Cities, Lahore and Amritsar, and this was made in Amritsar. And you may notice it's absolutely filthy. I don't know if you can see there. That's where a bit of the dust has been wiped. It's such an appealing artifact, but it's suffered neglect in storage which hasn't been hermetically sealed, so a lot of dust has got in. So again, this is a good excuse to have it very meticulously cleaned. We will have a great concentration on textiles. We will also show musical instruments, this taus, the peacock, which is a typically Sikh instrument, and this will allow Coventry to have all sorts of outreach events and musical performances which will be relevant to the contents of the exhibition. The continuity of the Mughal past is deeply embedded in Punjab of the 19th century, and these two jade boxes were made in Lahore for the 1851 exhibition. So these are very late exemplars of a tradition which started in the 17th century. And the Mayo School of Art in Lahore was producing copies, paintings of 17th century Mughal carpets. But 19th century crafts like pierced wood will be represented, and so will these marvellous fulkaris, of which we have recently added a certain number through a bequest from a German collector who collected mostly jewellery, Waltraud Ganguly, but she also collected some very fine fulkaris, so we'll put some of those in the exhibition as well. And I just conclude by saying that for me, one of the most gratifying aspects of the legacy of the Arts of the Sikh Kingdoms exhibition is meeting now, because it was so long ago, I'm meeting people who came to it as children, and they're now coming and saying, you know, we went to that exhibition and we remember it, and so we come back to the V&A and we bring our children and so on. As a museum curator, I'm very keenly aware of the importance of enthusing young people if museums are to survive and if knowledge of cultural legacy is to carry on. And in the context of Sikh culture, it's of fundamental importance that people come to museums and see these exhibitions and add their own expertise to our knowledge of our collections. Thank you.